So welcome to the Essential Issues for Human Resources. My name is Ann Pike. I work at United Way, and my main function is to oversee training and capacity building work. And this is our first attempt to go live webinars with training. And if it works well, and there was a huge response to this session, we are going to continue to push it through because it seems to be what people need in this day and age. Also with me from United Way is Suman Hota, and she is also works in the CI department with me. I'd like to begin with a preliminary land acknowledgement. I am not actually trained or educated in how to do it, so I won't do a formal one. I just want to acknowledge that, as we do with all our United Way external meetings, that this land was formerly owned by many indigenous communities, and we are residing on it right now. The other thing I wanted to do is to thank you so much for showing up every day in whatever form you do that, virtually or in person or however you do it, to keep your agencies going, to keep the people who need assistance with food, with resources, with help, with counseling, with information. On behalf of United Way, we are really grateful for all your efforts in an incredibly stressful situation. I just want to take a moment to look at how Zoom works, because some of you may not be familiar and some of you may be pros. If you don't mind switching, perfect. So because of the large number of registrants, we have more than 50 people on this call and almost added up to almost 100 on our wait list. So its topic is very popular, obviously. So that meant we had to keep you on mute, and video is disabled. We're going to see and explore how we can make this more communal as our experience goes on, and maybe we need to look at holding smaller webinars more often, but that will all be learning as I go, which is my new motto. But to encourage your participation, we want to make sure that you use the chat feature, which is in the bottom of your screen. It's about in the middle and it says chat. If you press on it now, you can use it to ask questions. And all of us will be working to aggregate the questions, to stream them when it's appropriate to the presenters, and then we will have a large Q&A at the end. So please keep your questions, comments coming. And just so you know, you can send private messages if you need to or want to, if you see somebody you haven't seen in a long time. And that is private, except that the host will see it. So just a little warning on that. Great. Now to introduce our presenters. We're thrilled to have today Safia Lakhani, who is an associate at Iler Campbell, a law firm that specializes in not-for-profit law. Safia is with the litigation team, and she specializes in employment and human rights. She's also the chair of the Center for Equality, Rights and Accommodation, so she has deep experience in many of the social justice issues we care about. Secondly, and big thanks to Family Service Toronto for loaning us their own HR program manager and expert. Teresa Tucker has a strong background both in Canada and the US in different aspects of HR at the director level, and she's taught at the college level as well. So welcome, Teresa, and thank you, FST. Great, I think that is it, and we'll turn it over to Safia.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Anne, and thanks everyone for joining. I'm just going to attempt to share my presentation. All right, well, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks United Way for arranging this and for inviting us to participate. I'm sure I don't have to remind anyone that we're sort of operating in an unprecedented climate, which brings with it a range of challenges that we will likely be navigating for some time. As many of you are probably aware, the province has extended the state of emergency which addresses restrictions on non-essential business and various other measures until May 12th. So that's our timeline, and it's very possible that the timeline will be extended even beyond that. I will say at the outset that even if we can't be together physically, we really are all in this together, and you'll see that that sentiment sort of colors the information that I'm sharing with respect to employment during this time. Okay, so we've received a number of questions, in talking to employers during this difficult time. So that includes questions about health and safety precautions in the workplace, remote work considerations, layoffs, a reduction in hours or pay, and also the issue that everyone is interested in, wage subsidies. We've also received a number of questions from staff who are attempting to navigate the current challenges, and those also relate to layoffs, to their ability to take sick leave or caregiver leave, and finally, the big question for many employees, qualification for some of the income support programs that are offered by the government. So I'm hoping to address those considerations today with a focus on the issues that concern employers. I do need to say right at the start that what I'm going to be sharing today is legal information. It's not legal advice. I don't know enough about the particular facts of any given situation to be able to give specific advice, but I can share information. I do also want to say, and I'm sure many of you are aware, that this is a rapidly evolving situation. The government's initiatives are changing by the day, and so for folks who are watching this presentation sometime after April 20th, it's very possible and in fact likely that the information may have changed. So it's important to stay sort of up to date on the various topics that I'm going to be addressing. Okay, so just by way of an overview, I'm going to begin by talking about the considerations for employers, including health and safety, human rights, questions around layoffs, and then supports that are available. I'm then going to speak briefly about employee considerations, again, related to health and safety, refusal of work, leaves, and income support. And then I believe that Charissa's gonna take over, and we'll have sort of questions and answers at the end. And as I think Anne shared, we're having folks post their questions in the chat feature on Zoom so that we can aggregate them and hopefully get to your questions. Okay. So the first, big sorts of questions that we're getting from employers relates to the fact that a number of non-essential workplaces have been forced to close, while other workplaces have been deemed essential and are remaining open. What I want to mention first is that given the current public health warning encouraging sheltering in place, where possible, we are encouraging employers to allow their staff to work from home. And Charissa is going to speak about some of the ways to do this most effectively in her presentation. But from our perspective, encouraging remote work allows you to avoid a number of the health and safety issues that may arise by requiring staff to be on site. If you are allowing your staff to work remotely, some of the considerations you'll want to turn your mind to include privacy. So for example, if you are going to be exchanging confidential information, you'll want to ensure that you have the proper protections in place so that information remains confidential. Secondly, you'll want to ensure that staff are aware that they should have an adequate work setup at home. You may want to consider developing a policy to ensure that staff understand it is their responsibility and not yours as the employer to ensure that their work from home arrangement meets the various legislative requirements around health and safety. As many of you know, and this is something that I'll address in just a moment, employers are bound by various pieces of legislation around health and safety, and that includes the Occupational Health and Safety Act, which requires you to ensure a workplace that is safe for your staff. So when the workplace becomes remote, you want to avoid any risk of a complaint around workplace safety where staff are not working sort of under your supervision and in the same workplace. So to that end, developing a policy that ensures adequate work from home arrangements is advisable. Okay, briefly, for those people who are still coming into whatever workplace you're operating in, it is critical to know your obligations under, again, the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as well as the Human Rights Code. Very briefly, when we're talking about the Occupational Health and Safety Act, as I mentioned, that is the legislation that sets standards around health and safety in Ontario. And as you probably know, recommendations coming out of public health are often changing, but there's a lot of encouragement around maintaining adequate sanitation of high sort of traffic areas, trying to limit gatherings, and in fact, by law, you have to limit gatherings to less than 5 people. So all of those measures you'll want to ensure you are implementing in some manner in a physical workplace. One of the sections of the Occupational Health and Safety Act that's getting a lot of attention right now relates to the right to refuse work that employees can exercise where they feel that the work will endanger themselves or another person. Now, there's a certain class of employees that are excluded under this legislation, including police officers, firefighters, certain healthcare workers. I'm not going to get into those specifics now, but I will say that in general, the process for refusing work sort of follows the following sort of lines. First, the worker would report the refusal to their supervisor. Second, the supervisor would investigate the issue in the presence of the worker. If the issue is resolved, so if the supervisor determines that in fact the workplace is safe and doesn't pose a threat to that individual, the worker is required to resume work. Or they can file a complaint with the Ministry of Labor, which will result in an investigation in the workplace. And the ministry will then make a determination about whether the workplace is safe. As you can imagine, and as some of you may have experienced, one of the big questions right now is, can staff refuse to work because of a generalized fear of transmission of COVID or sort of contracting COVID in the workplace? One of the tricky things right now is that we don't really have any direction in terms of case law on this issue because it is so new. But the general thinking is that a generalized sort of concern will not be sufficient to justify a right to refuse work. An employee would need to point to a specific issue, for example, another staff member in the workplace who perhaps has COVID-19, who isn't maintaining appropriate levels of distancing. They'd have to point to inadequate sort of cleaning and other sort of steps sort of not being taken in the workplace, but a general concern about COVID-19 is likely not to justify a right to refuse work. So regardless, an employer, should be aware that once there is a complaint that's filed, the employer has a duty to investigate the issue. So you'll want to take steps to do that and document it to show that you are acting in compliance with the legislation. I've also noted here the obligation to abide by the Human Rights Code, and I'm sure everyone is sort of familiar with that in more general terms. The Human Rights Code sets out certain protected grounds in the province of Ontario and requires that employers ensure that their workplace is free from discrimination on the basis of those grounds. The way that this relates to the current situation is that the code prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, ancestry, place of origin, color, or disability. So employers need to ensure that they are not allowing any form of workplace discrimination or harassment that might be occurring in connection with coronavirus-related concerns. And that's an important step to take. This includes ensuring that individuals under your supervision are not engaging in that form of behavior. Okay, One of the big ticket issues has to do with layoffs. And if you can take one thing away from this presentation, I would suggest that that be the point that I bolded here under item 3, to approach layoffs with caution. Now, there's been a lot of talk, and I've had clients come to me and say, well, you know, there are large organizations that are laying off, you know, hundreds of staff. It's a layoff on a temporary basis. It's true that the Employment Standards Act does list temporary layoffs in the legislation. It talks about a temporary layoff of between 13 weeks to 35 weeks. But something that employers often forget, and that isn't stated sort of frequently enough when we hear about these big cases, is that there is no automatic right to put staff on a temporary layoff. The layoff either needs to be contemplated in your employment agreement with your staff, or you should be getting their consent. The reason for this is that a layoff is effectively a unilateral change to the terms of the employment agreement. And if you don't get consent to that change, you could be looking at a potential claim by the employee for something known as constructive dismissal. Effectively, that is the same as saying that you were terminated and you weren't given notice that you should have been given with respect to your termination. So temporary layoffs is, there is no automatic right to lay your staff off. You should be going back to your employment agreements to see whether it includes a clause that says, you know, in extenuating circumstances where there's a shortage of work, the employer can lay off staff. But without that, you should be getting the consent of staff. Additionally, even if you do have a clause like that one, note that the maximum layoff period under the ESA, it can be extended if certain things are done, but you should take it to be 13 weeks. So if it extends even a day beyond that, you could be looking at a permanent layoff, which has other implications. Now, I'll touch very briefly on a permanent layoff. So I've spoken about the temporary layoff. A permanent layoff is effectively the same as a termination. Employers, if they are terminating staff without cause, assuming you don't have cause for termination, and in the case of a shortage of work, there wouldn't be cause. If you are terminating staff without cause, you are required to give them reasonable notice. Now, I'm not going to get into the math of that now, but reasonable notice can be as low as the statutory minimum set out in the Employment Standards Act, which is, as many of you will know, 1 week per year worked to a maximum of 8 weeks. But unless you have clear language in your employment agreements that limits that amount to the statutory minimum, you could be looking at the much higher range, which is known as common law notice. And courts rarely sort of abide by this. It's known as the rule of thumb that's often cited and rarely followed. But just to give you a sense of what you'd be looking at in terms of that notice, it's 1 month per year. And it really depends on a range of factors, including the employee's age, the type of position they held, the type of experience they have, or education. So don't take that to be sort of set in stone, but so that you're familiar with the range that you could owe. If you are permanently laying off your staff, you may be looking at something that is in or around that amount. Okay. So what are some alternatives to layoffs? I've already talked about a consensual salary or scheduling reduction. Consider requesting staff to agree to a reduction in hours or salary in the circumstances. Now, I'll get to this a bit later and very briefly, but there are a number of supports available to staff currently, including the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit. So you may have staff who are actually willing to agree to a reduction in hours or to a temporary layoff so that they can qualify for that benefit to allow everybody to sort of work through this difficult time. So getting written consent to any reduction is important. Another alternative that you might consider is the Supplementary Unemployment Benefit Plan. Now, that's a plan that will allow you as an employer to top up an employee's EI benefits during periods of work stoppage, illness, or injury, up to 35 weeks. So effectively, you would have staff who are receiving EI benefits, which are 55% of the salary, up to $54,200. So that's the maximum they would receive. And as an employer, you would top that amount up. And so, you know, you could do a top up of 50%. You could do, you could do something more. It's really your decision to make about how much you can top up your staff. Just note that the employer can only top up the employee to 95%. So they can't be sort of, receiving EI benefits and then receiving significant amounts from the employer. But you'll note that, this can be a good arrangement, particularly where you have staff that are on the lower salary end who are going to receive a significant amount through EI, and so your top up is limited. This plan requires basically the agreement of the employer, the employee, or the union, if there's a union involved, and Service Canada, to ensure that the EI or the payments that are supplementing EI are not classified as income, so they wouldn't detract from the amounts that your staff are receiving. One of the benefits of this benefit is that it ensures continuity. And it allows for staff to maintain, a reasonable sort of lifestyle during this time, and hopefully to come back to work, once this period has passed. Also, the waiting time for this has been reduced considerably, and I've heard from colleagues that have prepared sub-plans that they've been approved within a day or two. So that's one of the real sort of, it's a real perk here. And it's something for employers to keep in mind. Okay, another alternative that's available to employers is the work sharing plan. The work sharing plan allows you to divide work between staff and reduce the hours of those staff somewhere between 10% and 60%. A work sharing agreement has to be at least 6 weeks long, but it can be as long as 76 weeks. So the government has increased the period of that. Again, in the same way as the sub-plan, there has to be a joint agreement between the staff, the employer, and Service Canada. And the plan needs to explain basically how you're going to, reduce the hours or workload of the staff. The minimum number of staff in a work sharing unit is 2. So if you are in a workplace where you have a number of staff who are carrying out the same task, you might consider reducing their respective loads and dividing them amongst your staff. And the benefit of this is that you can have them receive EI benefits and you are paying them the reduced amount of salary. So to carry out the work sharing plan, you would issue records of employment to staff that indicate on there the work sharing code. You would go ahead with the reduction. And then again, this is a way to equalize the salaries that staff are receiving. I know I'm taking up a lot of time, so I'm going to move through these last couple of slides quickly. The wage subsidies, this is what everyone wants to hear about. I'll start with the less exciting one first. The temporary wage subsidy. This is a 10% subsidy that's available to eligible employers, including not-for-profits that have an existing business number and a payroll program with the CRA. This subsidy is 10% of remuneration paid from March 18th until June 19th, 2020. And it is up to $1,375 per eligible employee to a maximum of $25,000 per employer. What's important to note about the 10% subsidy is that there's no formal application process. There's source deduction remittances for income tax that you would simply carry out when you're filing your taxes. So there's no application that's required. Now, the more exciting subsidy is the Canada Emergency Wage Subsidy, which is up to 75%, and this became law on April 11th. This subsidy is available to eligible employers, including charities and nonprofits. But to be eligible, unlike the 10% subsidy, employers must provide documentation showing a decline of at least 15% in revenues in March and 30% of revenues in April or May. And this is going to be as compared to the average revenue in January and February of this year, or as compared to revenue generated for the same month last year. Now, this subsidy is up to $847 per week per employee, retroactive to 2020. There is no limit on it. So that's also distinguishes it from the previous wage subsidy. The eligible periods extend to June 6th. Employers, we've been getting a lot of questions about this. Employers are expected to top up their staff for the remaining 25%. So the expectation is not that you cut your staff salary to 75% and pay them fully out on the subsidy. The expectation is that this is there to assist you as employers and you pay your staff out the balance. This application, unfortunately, still hasn't been made available. It's expected to be made available in late April and early May of 2020. Some things to remember about the wage subsidies: you can't be double dipping. You can't take advantage of both the 10% and the 75%. If you've qualified for the 10%, it will be deducted from the 75% that you receive. The government's been clear about that. You also can't double dip with respect to subsidies and programs like work sharing, which we discussed. So if staff are receiving EI supplements for their time being worked, you can't be paying them the balance with a wage subsidy that you've received. And similarly, you can't obviously claim subsidy for staff who have been terminated. The idea here is that if you have laid off staff, you can apply for the wage subsidy and hopefully allow them to return to work. Now I do know I'm running very short on time, so perhaps I won't. You know what? I'll just say, and because I know the focus here is on employers. Again, for employees, they don't have, there's no right by employers to lay off their staff. But for employees, if they don't agree to reduced hours and wages, they are potentially risking foregoing their ability to qualify for the emergency response benefit, which is $2,000 per month for 4 months. So there is an incentive for staff to work with the employer, and by the same token for employers to be sort of mindful of all of the ways that are available to them to ensure that, staff are able to continue receiving some form of income in whatever form. So I will end with that, and I'll turn it over to Charissa, and I will be happy to respond to questions about this when the time comes.
Charissa?
Yes.
We have a question that might dovetail well with your presentation.
Okay.
How do we maintain obligations to a safe workplace when employees are working from home? So are you looking at that in your presentation, or?
I will touch on it. It's certainly been an issue for us at Family Service Toronto. So there's not a perfect answer right now, but I will touch on what we've done at Family Service Toronto.
Great.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. What I'm going to do is go over what we've done at Family Service Toronto to deal with the challenges of COVID-19. And I've divided my presentation into 3 areas of focus, which I think is on the next page of the handout. Yes. So the structure we used was 3 phases just to organize ourselves. 1, 2, and 3. So I'll talk about that a bit. Then I'll talk about how we provided strategic direction and then communication of essential messages to staff. So the first thing that we did in response to COVID-19 was to establish an emergency response team, which is actually part of our emergency response policy. And it was probably the only real component of that policy that we could use since a lot of these policies anticipate natural disasters such as fire, water damage, that sort of stuff. But we did implement that right away. And our team consists of our executive director, directors, and other assigned staff, such as me in my role as a human resource partner. In terms of the timing at Family Service Toronto, we suspended group programming on March the 13th, which was the Friday, and it was kind of aligned with the schools, with the message that the schools would be closed after March break. And then we directed staff to work from home on March 16, and that excluded management staff. So that's kind of the timing. So one of the first things in terms of what we did initially was try to ensure the safety of clients, especially our most vulnerable clients. So that would have been staff doing telephone check-ins just to get a status update and see, you know, who would need more immediate services. And then the other thing we tried to do was try to continue service as much as possible with staff just fairly abruptly going to working at home. So basically on Friday, we told everyone work at home on Monday. So there was not a lot of time for planning and for some staff to take things that they needed to work at home. Initially, what we did is we started to communicate immediately to staff, which is continued on a daily basis. And kind of a combination of giving reassurance to staff, reminding them that the employee assistance program and the counseling available through our benefits plan, and then also doing practical things, providing laptops, providing secure connection to our internal electronic systems through you know, VPNs. So that was another concern. You just can't use, we don't want to jeopardize the security of our documentation by using computers that are not properly secure. We also made a commitment to staff that we would continue their pay for these first 3 weeks. So we really looked at this phase as an adjustment period to give staff an opportunity to deal with personal issues that came up because of COVID-19. So children at home, caregiver responsibilities that they had to deal with. So that was, yeah, that was an adjustment period for management and for frontline staff. In terms of the successes, I think that our executive director did a really good job of quickly providing us with a structure in terms of the phases, and also clearly communicated the role and expectation of the emergency response team as well as management staff. Because I think at the beginning of this, you feel that I felt immobilized, it was a bit overwhelming. So he was fairly directive in terms of what we needed to do, which was very helpful at that time. So I think overall, we reacted well to the situation and we transitioned fairly quickly to working at home. So that would be phase one. The challenges we had in phase one was getting laptops, you know, not enough laptops for everyone. So how are they going to work at home? Maybe if I was an admin staff and reception duties was part of my responsibilities, that was a difficulty as well. And then the other piece was the management, I mean, started to work excessive hours to get all this going. So one of the things that we did at the end of this phase was to say to managers, you don't have to come in, you can work from home, and we used a lot of conferencing. So that was phase one. Phase two is our current stage, and what we wanted to do is to stabilize and fully implement our off-site service for clients. So we moved to the telephone counseling, the online counseling. The other thing we did is communicated expectations. So for dealing with clients, for dealing with funders, and also expectations for staff. So in that phase, we said to staff, you have to be working at home. You know, so the goal of our plan was not to have layoffs. So you needed to be doing work. And if you didn't have work to do, then we would redeploy you to another role or another department that needed support. During that period of time, we developed and implemented a work at home guidelines that employees had to sign off on and return to us. And during the guidelines, some of the things we stress is you're working at home, but all of our policies still apply. Also, the other piece was confidentiality and privacy of documentation, and also care of equipment, laptops or keyboards that you were using at home. So those were some of the things we emphasized. We also forwarded work at home tips, how to structure your day, to take breaks, as well as ergonomic tips, how to set up your work office, and just to try and prevent unnecessary work injuries. The other piece we did in phase 2 is we implemented regular supervision and team meetings. Some teams were already doing that, and we implemented it for everyone. And some of the benefits of that, not just to focus on work expectations, but it also gave the supervisor a chance to check in and see how is the employee doing, what type of personal circumstances are they dealing with that would have an impact on their work. I think in terms of successes, the work at home guidelines, we did it in collaboration with the union. They actually prepared the PowerPoint on the work at home tips. So I think one of the successes, it definitely improved labor relations. And also we didn't have any resistance from staff in signing the guidelines. The other success, the daily updates really provided the structure, security, and stability to staff in a time of a lot of upheaval and uncertainty, and staff looked forward to them. And I think that they really increased trust and confidence in the leadership team. And also provided a sense of connection for staff who really miss being in the office and connecting with their colleagues and with clients. Also for staff who live alone, you know, and the problems of isolation. It also met the ongoing need for staff for more communication, which is always, you know, anytime you do an employee survey, that's what you get. It reduced stress and anxiety because we tried to give a roadmap of what was coming next. So that was one of the successes. One of the surprises we had was the need for that emotional reassurance and well-being. We included a lot of stuff about the EAP, mental health supports, understanding the stress and anxiety that staff were experiencing. And this was an area that they often said, we need more of this. You need to understand how we're feeling. So that was a bit surprising, but that was the need. The challenges during phase 2 is changing some of our work practices. Obviously, we don't have clients coming into a location. We're doing it by telephone and online. So, you know, the tools that we use, you know, everybody wanted Zoom. We already had other tools and kind of dealing with that, with, you know, the challenges of that. And also for some admin staff that didn't have enough work to do, I think that one of the things we did, we actually laid off one staff, and that was, she requested it, and that was probably the attraction of the emergency response benefit. Excuse me. The other thing that we had to deal with was the loss on productivity, and a lot of staff felt really uneasy about that. So we had to reassure them that it's fine, they're doing the best they can, that sort of stuff. So balancing being compassionate to staff, understanding their situation while trying to respond to the needs of clients. So we're still in our second phase, and probably it's going to go until June 1st, and then we will go on to the third phase. But I think that's probably, I think I'll end my presentation with that. We can talk about some other stuff later. Thank you.
A wise decision, because of course, who knows? No one dares predict quite how long this will go.
Exactly.
So one of the questions that I put out there was, did you have anything else to add, Safia, first before we go to the questions?
No, I mean, I'm happy to get into, you know, specifics as we go. I sort of cut the employee side piece a bit short, but I'm happy to speak a bit more about that. And I think Charissa's, maybe I'll just say that, you know, it's important to approach this. You have the legal sort of obligations, and there's that side, but I think a well-rounded, holistic look at the toll that current climate is taking sort of emotionally on people's productivity and mental health and all the rest of it is I think that's really important for employers to keep in mind.
That's a good segue, because there are a couple of questions, and I think they have a human resources bent and a legal bent. Someone has asked if people are distressed because someone or a team has been let go, can the employer take on a responsibility to have a virtual goodbye for them? Or is this not appropriate and best left to staff teams? Are there any legal challenges with doing that, Safia?
I mean, I can't see that there would be. So just to clarify, this is somebody who's been sort of laid off and who's no longer in the workplace, and staff are sort of wanting to have some kind of commemorative event, or?
Yes, the situation where you'd normally go to a bar and have a drink with the person.
Yeah, I mean, I don't look, assuming that the departure was on sort of favorable terms, I don't see an issue sort of facilitating that. I mean, I think typically that might be something that's planned by the employee, you know, by staff, unless the person sort of resigned. But if there was a positive sort of relationship and a mutual parting of ways, I think it's not an issue. I might be a bit cautious about doing that if there were underlying sort of, you know, if it wasn't such a positive departure.
It could end up being better placed as a peer responsibility to pull that together than the onus on the employer.
Right.
And Charissa, did you have any comments in that regard?
I agree. I usually at the staff level, you know, in terms of it being done by the overall employer, typically not, except if it's a retirement of a long-term employee. But I think at the staff level, and I agree with Safia, depending on, you know, were they, how the layoff was managed. Did the person agree? Did they not agree? That sort of stuff. So I agree with her response.
Yeah. On that note, another question that is arisen is how to give bad news about a termination, perhaps, or a work sharing arrangement that's going to really cut into the personal economies of each of the people. Giving that virtually, it makes me think of that movie with George Clooney, Up in the Air. I don't know if anyone on the line has seen this, but that was something that they had to do. So legal issues and tips and human issues, if you're having, because I mean, most of these conversations will have to be virtual.
Yeah, sure. Oh, I'm happy to jump in just briefly. You're right. I mean, our typical advice in cases of termination or, giving this sort of news is to do it in person, but that's obviously not possible in the current climate. I think you can proceed by phone or by, something like this, Zoom or whatever else. The only caution that I will flag, and this is something I've reminded clients of, is not doing a group call. Sometimes there's a temptation, and I've heard folks saying, we're going to have to lay off these 7 people. Can I have a group call with them? And my advice typically is definitely don't. At least initially, people are obviously going to take this news in different ways. It may have a different impact on each of them. And so make the time to have individual conversations. And if you think it would help afterwards to have a group call to talk about what this looks like for the workplace going forward, I think that's fine. But being mindful that, this is sensitive information for your employees. And there are also privacy obligations in terms of that employment information. So relaying that one-on-one, I think is important.
Did you have thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was a case lately where somebody laid off people by Zoom and they got really negative publicity from it. In our case, because we're unionized, in situations like that, I would have a talk with the union president and say, here's the situation, we need to do it by phone, and then they would be on the call, fairly silent, and then they would follow up with the employee afterwards. We did have a case since we've been off of having to do a discipline over the phone, and I think it went fairly well. And in terms of the approach, is you're a little bit more low key than you usually would be, kind of recognizing that you can't see you can't see body language. You really don't know how the person is reacting. So, simple things with terminations or discipline in these cases is getting to the point and telling them what the next steps will be.
And in either of your experience, is the regular support post-termination available for employees who've been let go under COVID, or does that not apply? Do they still have access to an EPA or something like that?
Yeah, our employees would have access to an EPA, EAP, and also, you're trying to do it in a way that they feel it's not personal and they can maintain communication with human resources with respect to things about, their record of employment, their benefits. So even though you document it, they want to have that phone call, if somebody calls for a reference. So I think if it's done in a professional way, people have no hesitation to call you for that information.
Great. A couple of quick questions. Sharing the work at home guidelines document, I think that was FST. And I believe, is that the one you've done or you will be doing it?
I've completed the work at home. I'm completing physical distancing when you return to the workplace. So we're trying to look at, I should be probably completed that by today and get it approved by the end of the week, yes.
That's great. And we are committed to getting you, I think, as I said, for those who came in late, there will be a recap, a written recap of the conversation and the questions here. We will be able to send you some questions and answers. Iler Campbell has already sourced some really key areas because there is where you can get information, because there's so much information around. It's really important to hone in on sites that are both clear language, but that are from really reliable sources, like Imagine Canada, for example, is doing a lot of work in this area and would be an excellent source. So those will be following the training time here. They're up on the slides, and we'll also be emailing everybody who's asked for this. The other question, Safia, have a draft policy re-employees responsible for ensuring a safe workplace?
I mean, I don't have a policy on hand, but I'm sure that there are templates available, possibly on the Ministry of Labor, you know, related to occupational health and safety. I can look around, and if I find something, perhaps, and I can include that in the follow-up materials. But you know, ultimately, you're just getting employees to acknowledge that they are responsible for any liability that may arise as a result of working from home. They're responsible for ensuring an adequate workplace, and they don't have any claims against you as employers in the event that something does arise while they're working remotely.
Great. And we're also checking around with some of the larger agencies if they have policies, procedures, templates to share. So we will include those as well. This is a private question, I believe, for Safia. A staff is pregnant and not feeling well, stress and lack of sleep, doesn't have the space and equipment to work at home during COVID, and wants to take an emergency unpaid leave and will return to work when COVID is over until she goes on parental leave. So she wants to take emergency leave, go back if possible, and then parental leave. If she does it, will it affect her qualifications for parental leave or number of hours she will qualify for if she's not actually working? She's already met the 600 required workers for the year before her leave.
That's a good question. So I believe that the leave she would take, there are sickness benefits available through EI for folks who need to take leave, you know, sort of in the short term. And I would imagine that she would want to access that. To be honest, I don't know off the top of my head whether that would impact the ability to take parental leave. But if she sort of has the insurable hours, I don't imagine that it would. I can look into that though and sort of put that on, you know, whatever memo comes out of this.
That would be great, because you could see it happening in other situations. Somebody is sick, it's sciatica or something that's really impossible to work at home. They take an emergency unpaid leave and they want to come back once this is over, and then something else happens.
Yeah, so I guess the question when we're talking about an unpaid leave is whether there's any intention to access EI benefits during that time, because I think this individual would qualify for sickness benefits currently. So I guess the issue is, if they are receiving those sickness benefits, would that, you know, what impact would that have on the leave, on the parental leave? If they're not intending to apply for those, I don't see that the time away would impact the parental leave. It would be an unpaid sick leave, as you said, with, you know, without receiving any kind of EI.
Thanks. Can you see the comments, Safia?
Yeah, I can. Okay. Oh, okay.
At the bottom, there's one from Mandy Abrams.
Okay. So the question says, what are the risks associated with bringing laid off staff back for time limited short contracts? Would I create a new term limited term contract, or would I recall them and then lay them off again under the same contract? So I guess a few things. First of all, I'd be interested in knowing what the original employment agreement was when staff were laid off. So again, was it a layoff that they agreed to? What were the terms of that original agreement? And assuming that everything was sort of squared off with that original period, so they came and they worked for a period of time and then their employment sort of ended because of the layoff, I would typically suggest getting a new agreement in place with them, is particularly if you know that their employment is going to be time limited. There is a risk, I mean, as I mentioned, if you have an indefinite employment agreement and you decide to bring it to an end for whatever reason, you do have termination pay obligations to your staff. And those will arise at the time that the employment agreement ends. Whereas with a fixed term contract, assuming it isn't repeatedly renewed, the employment agreement just comes to a natural end, and then you part ways without having those additional obligations in terms of severance or, as I said, termination pay. So if you are bringing back staff and you know that you will not be bringing them back for the permanent long run, but rather a short period of time, I would typically suggest a fixed term agreement that makes it clear what their end date would be. So that would be my response to that question.
Great. Have you experienced that at FST, Charissa, or is that out of the box?
It would be out of the box because we would have to lay them off and give them the opportunity to bump or to be recalled, especially if it's going to be for less hours. Yeah, so we don't really experience that as much.
Great. And then another question, does essential work need to be limited to teams of 5 or less?
I mean, that's my understanding. There's a restriction on having 5 people sort of not practicing social distancing. So I think if you do have teams, you'll want to perhaps have staggered work times or arrangements that ensure that people are not sort of in groups of more than 5 at any given time. I think there are separate sort of regulations for certain industries. So the construction industry, I think there are perhaps different rules that apply there. But outside of that, I think, so for example, if you're talking about an office space, you don't want 5 people sort of gathering in one location, but as long as you're maintaining social distancing, I think you would be sort of compliant with the current provincial health guidelines.
So I'm familiar with, for example, the Liberty Village Health Center, which has a rehab component and a primary care component. And there's probably about 16 people in all in that. So they would, then they're reasonably close quarters. They definitely have to be staggering their services to make it so that it wasn't more than 5. And we fund a number of community health centers as well in some of our community service buildings. So that would apply additionally. Oh, excellent. Somebody is finding our conversation constructive. A couple more questions that had come in previously. I hope I described this right, but they're wondering if either of you, when you had to look, or if you do have to look at laying off folks, if you have a template that you look at to see how many people could actually benefit from work sharing, therefore they might be best dealt with that. How many employees are closer to retirement? So that might be a conversation of having, considering them to take early retirement, considering people who are closer, who have higher severance requirements. Is there some sort of a document or template that would help people look at that? Or does it not just have to be individual organization to organization?
Yeah, I think for us, from my perspective, it would have to be individual, because if you had more seniority or you've been with us for a long period of time, it wouldn't, you would be most protected in terms of any layoffs. So any type of, anything that's different from what we have in our collective agreement would result from a discussion with the union. And they might be saying there's employees who want to leave, or what can we do? So that would be a one-off from our collective agreement.
And for management staff, would there have to be a gridding?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot with management staff now, so there's a lot of flexibility. So for instance, if you're an exceptional manager and you want to retire, we will give you the flexibility to stay 3 days a week, or, you know, reduce your hours, that sort of stuff. But of course, you know, with management staff, you know, they're not in the union, so we have a lot of flexibility in terms of restructuring and just, you know, the requirement to pay severance. So there's more flexibility to keep them, and there's more flexibility to lay them off, to terminate employment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts from you on that, Safia?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I wish there was some formula or some sort of step-by-step assessment guide to figuring out, you know, what the most economical and reasonable approach might be. But, you know, I think you'd have to look, as Teresa said, at the individual sort of facts and the teams and determine what makes the most sense. I mean, you know, I think considering how much notice you would have to give certain employees if you are terminating their employment, that's probably going to come into play. But, you know, other than that, I don't know of any sort of magic chart or formula that helps with that, other than actually looking at all of the sort of factors and figuring out what makes the most sense.
The hard work of working it through.
Yeah.
Have you heard of any agencies, I think this might be particularly to Teresa, whose senior staff might be taking a significant cut and then smaller cuts across the board as you go down the pay scale in order to keep everybody employed? Is that a viable approach?
Not at this point. You know, not when everyone's working 12 hours a day type of thing. We're not at that point. We would probably, if we need be, we would consider, in terms of management staff, reducing the days of work. Yeah, it was something that we would consider, but we're not looking at it at this point. At FST, we don't have a lot of management. We feel we don't have management staff, and employees often say you don't have enough management staff as well. So yeah, so it wouldn't be, a while back we reduced the number of managers, and now we're trying to build it up again. So
right.
Yeah.
And I think there was a final query about, this was just a rough question. If you have policies, if you have robust policies in place around HR, disaster planning, risk management, have either of you seen special or particular elements related to COVID that need to go into those policies? Or if they're robust enough, do they seem to be covering this contingency?
No. I think our policies did not anticipate a pandemic. It's mentioned in the policy in terms of the procedures and the processes. It doesn't anticipate, so we would have to look at them and talk about, you know, how we would adjust policies, especially because we're not certain, you know, is it seasonal? Are we all back to work? And then do we have to go back home again? And what does that mean in terms of how we plan day to day, is we're probably not going to go back to the way it was before.
Mm.
Just because of social distancing, we're going to have more employees working at home than we had previously. So no, I haven't seen anything. There's a lot of information out there, but I haven't seen anything in terms of those policies that relate to COVID, but I'm sure they'll be coming.
And Safia, anything of that nature?
I don't think so. I mean, I can't think of, I would think, as Teresa said, I would think that most policies didn't anticipate the particulars of the circumstances we're in. So it may be worth sort of taking this as a learning kind of moment and incorporating some, relevant terms into those policies that do address the circumstances we're in.
Well, that's interesting. So this seems like it could be a small bit of work for somebody, probably United Way, to try and source some documents from other jurisdictions. I'm thinking of 9/11 from some of the social service agencies there, or even abroad where they've been through much worse conditions than we have. So there might be some, because I think the thing that people are just very working so hard and they're so stressed, and the last thing they want to do is start from scratch on creating a policy around pandemics. They want to beg, borrow, and steal and integrate it into their existing good practices around, say, risk management. So that may be something we can try and do to dovetail with the resources you're both supplying, which would be helpful.
Yeah, I'll take a look and see what, I belong to the HR Association in the US. I'll take a look and see what they have, if there's anything useful, and I'll send it to you.
Oh, wonderful. United Way is also part of the, with the City of Toronto, the big agency table. I think FST is there. So that might be a, YWCA, YMCA,
right,
with their international backgrounds. Right. Red Cross might have something to share.
Right. I'll see what they have. Yeah.
Well, that is great. I don't see any more questions coming in. I was going to give the last word to Teresa, surprisingly enough for her. But was there anything else either of you wanted to stress?
I think that this really, COVID-19 really changes the workplace and the way that we do our work. I think previously a lot of people were hesitant about working at home for certain positions for a variety of reasons. And I think that, we really have to go through the process of looking at positions and considering, can they work remotely? Is it a benefit to the organization, to the employee? I know for us, in terms of, and we're still recruiting, that it means that we could get employees from that don't have to be residing in Toronto. Commute is such a big deal. So I think that's one change. It forces us, we were going that way anyhow, but it forces us to look at that. What is it to manage employees virtually? And the other piece I feel, which I touched on, is, the kind of need to have a compassionate, understanding employer as part of the, not just because I'm going through a difficult situation, of the management style because very often we try to separate personal and professional. And, for us, it was like, okay, go to the EAP, and the response is, no, we want you as an organization to deal with it. So, we don't want to go to EAP. So I think that will make a change in how we manage how responsive are we to personal situation, whether it's young kids at home that you're trying to homeschool while doing some work, or senior parents that no longer can go to a day program. So I think it will have a change in how we do what we do and how mobile can we be. Am I tied to my office with my paper policies, etc.? So I think it will have a big change on how we do our work. And then obviously, some of the challenges for us with is they don't all have access to computers. So at this time, how do they access our services? So looking at that as well.
Well, that's great. And thank you very much. Any last words from you, Safia?
Very brief, but I did see two questions, and sorry, I was on the bottom of this sort of chat, but there were two questions. Is it okay if I just address them very quickly?
Please, totally.
Okay, they were pre-questions. One of them is, and just because I think they may have wider relevance, if someone has COVID-19 and everyone knows who it is, how can their privacy be protected? So privacy is a big issue as it relates to COVID-19, particularly because, obviously there are privacy obligations that an employer has, but there are also safety obligations with respect to others in the workplace. So what some of you might have seen is a warning if you become aware that somebody is showing symptoms of COVID-19 in the workplace. Obviously, you should be directing them to leave and to quarantine themselves and to seek appropriate care. But you may have seen warnings going out which simply state somebody on this floor is showing symptoms of X, Y, or Z. The last time they were here was on this date. If they were in any common spaces, you might want to alert individuals to those spaces because they may also be sort of at risk. And you'd probably want to say something like it's a presumptive case of COVID unless you know that it's confirmed. I don't recommend, and certainly you should not be releasing the individual's name or personal details. Here, the question seems to be if everyone knows who it is. I'm not sure you as an employer can really do much to scale that back if people, for whatever reason, have already received that information. But of course, maybe emphasizing the importance of protecting privacy and the fact that you can't confirm any information and importance again of respecting particularly the health information of specific staff is important. Sorry, I thought I was going to sneeze. Okay, I've held it in. The other question here very quickly is if an employee has worked for 22 years and their severance is high, is it more likely for them to stay to avoid high severance? So I'm not sure I understand the question about them staying to avoid high severance, but again, if you do have somebody who's worked with you for a very long time, that you want to be even more careful about proceeding with something like a temporary layoff or a permanent layoff. You should get proper advice on the amount of notice you would need to give that individual. Again, if you're looking at a temporary period of stoppage of work, you might consider some of the other options that I discussed in my presentation. You might also have an individual who is prepared to agree to a temporary period away, provided that they will return and their entitlement to notice or pay in lieu of notice and what you've called severance here would remain. So that's something to bear in mind. I think those were the only two additional questions. I'll second what Charissa has said here. I mean, I think that this is a difficult time for everyone, for employees who are in some cases particularly vulnerable, who are concerned about losing their positions, and in cases where they are working on site, who may have additional concerns about health and safety. At the same time, employers and particularly, not-for-profits and charities are dealing with, you know, the realities of operational costs and needing to make their bill payments, and then also to pay their staff and make responsible decisions in that regard. So I think keeping yourself informed about your legal responsibilities is extremely important. I've tried to give an overview of some of those obligations as they relate to health and safety, your notice obligations when you are terminating staff, the fact that, you know, you don't have a right to lay staff off without their consent. But aside from those things, I think keeping apprised of the government's announcements with respect to support initiatives is really important, because again, the information is changing by the day. And there will hopefully be, you know, some of the support initiatives will hopefully be finalized in the coming days so that employers can take advantage of them. And that includes the 75% wage subsidy. I think that's it from my end, and it was a pleasure to speak with you all, and hopefully we're able to get through your questions.